So, Naomi, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So, Naomi, can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the details? Just about you, what you do, your other podcasts.
So, I've been a TV producer for almost 20 years, which sort of gives away my age a little bit. But I've been doing that, and I've mainly worked in factual television. So everything from documentaries to reality TV shows, whether it's, orchestrating a wedding on Don't Tell the Bride in an alien cave, or whether it's casting the Big Brother housemates, or it's doing documentaries or working on salvage hunters or true crime documentaries. So I've kind of done a lot of programming over the years. And I now on the side, I do podcast hosting as well. And I also teach 1 day a week at a local college, and that's teaching TV production and now podcast production as well.
Oh, wow, Naomi. My God. You've got a lot under your belt there, haven't you?
Yes, I don't sleep very often. I do have 2 children, and I think they actually are the biggest job. So everything else just feels quite easy compared to having them.
That's amazing that you teach it as well. You must be really passionate about what you do.
Do you know what? I think it's just that where I'm from, I live in Essex, and there's not that many opportunities here. You often have to go into London. And sometimes we have students that, the cost of a train ticket, which is extortionate, into this local area. And actually, we've had such a positive response. And what I think a lot of my students have really gravitated towards, funnily enough, is true crime. They're fascinated by the psychology. They're fascinated by the why, not always the what. It's normally the why. And I find that really interesting and really refreshing that young kids want to do that. So I'm here for it.
Yeah, it sounds like it. What is your other podcast? You have another podcast as well. Did you start that one first?
Yeah, so I actually got into podcasting because I live very close to the Lubbock family. So Stuart Lubbock was the man who was found in the swimming pool of Michael Barrymore. He had been raped and murdered, and I knew his family, and sadly Stuart's father passed away. And what happened after that is the battle for justice went on for such a long time, and it got nowhere, and there were arrests, and there was all this stuff, but there was also a lack of accurate information in the press. People went forward with Michael Barrymore, they went forward with that narrative, and Stuart and his hit the fact he was a victim, he got kind of pushed to the side. So I spoke to the family and I offered to do a podcast. They'd already done a documentary for Channel 4, and it's called Body in the Pool, and it's absolutely just mind-blowing. And I thought, you know what, I wonder if we can do a bit more, because sometimes with podcasts, more people will speak because you don't have to give their full identity. So I did a 6-part podcast series that did really well, and lots of the local press got on top of it, and actually some of the national press did as well. And then it wasn't long after that I spoke to Claudia Lawrence's mum. So Claudia Lawrence went missing in 2009, that she went missing. And she was a chef from York, and she was walking to work one morning and she disappeared. And so I worked with Joan, her mother, and we decided together that we would try and do a podcast that would give people a little bit more information about her disappearance and what really happened, because unfortunately Claudia Lawrence was a single woman who was living a really social life, but unfortunately what happened was the press, and there was a lot of misogyny in the way it was reported. They were focusing a lot on some of the relationships she'd had, and a lot of them had been with married men, or she'd had a few boyfriends on the go at the same time. She was a single pretty woman in her 30s, why not necessarily the married man stuff, but she had a lot, she had fun, and they kind of focused on that. And what happened was the quest for justice with her, it kind of got misrepresented. So a lot of people were sort of like, oh, well, if you're going to dabble with married men, this is what happens. I actually read comments that actually said that. And I was so angered. Obviously, no, okay, cheating, that's a whole separate issue. This is about a woman who's gone missing and has been taken from her family. And so I did the podcast with her mum, and that went really well. And then I came across this one. I came across Luke Mitchell and Jodi Jones, and I was looking for another case to do. And I went online and I just started looking for cases that I didn't know a lot about. And this one kept coming up. It was actually via Twitter. So I went on Twitter and I saw all these supporters of Luke. And all I could see was justice for Luke Mitchell and Jodi Jones. So my initial reaction was, okay, this has been a double murder. That's what I thought. And then as I looked into it, I realised that Luke is very much alive and has actually been convicted of killing Jodie. And so I nearly stepped away from it. I thought, oh, well, this is done. Why would I make a series on this? My whole thing is to look at justice. And the case got me. It was so odd. It was unlike anything I'd really ever seen before. I mean, there was this, and I know we'll get into the details, but the whole case against Luke Mitchell felt very unsafe. It didn't feel like a safe conviction to me. And I'm not someone that, believes that all these people are innocent in prison. I do believe that there are miscarriages of justice, and there has been proven to be. With Luke, I don't know if he's guilty or innocent. I have no idea. But the podcast and the reason I decided to do it ended up being a 7-part series on it is because the phenomenon that was kind of around it, all these people truly believed that he was innocent. And it was incredible to see a group with tens of thousands of people signing petitions for him, a Facebook group where people were literally giving up their lives to support this man that they've never even met. And I found that really intriguing. And my first true crime podcast I ever listened to was Serial. And that was about Adnan Syed and Hayman Lee. And I know that almost kind of broke ground with true crime podcasting. And I thought, God, I wonder if this has got similar themes, to that. And I'm not an investigator. I'm not part of the law network. But what I am is a storyteller. So I try and tell the story. And I told the story for what I saw. And I did luckily have access to a lot of stuff. And I know we're going to talk about that. But that's the reason I ended up taking that on.
Yeah, well, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. Why did you? Because I know you said a little bit about it in the first episode. But the same as me, I heard of the story. So I suppose like most people, I thought that he was guilty. I didn't delve too deep. And, I'd always wanted to cover it. It was going to be one of the cases that I covered. But when I met you at CrimeCon and you told me about your podcast and I listened to the episodes, like you, I only want to do things different, not do it the same way again. And there's just no way I could, better it or make it come out different. You did an amazing job.
Oh, thank you.
You are a fantastic storyteller, really. And the only thing I could think of doing was to have you on and to talk about it. And that's why you're here today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. You have been so lovely because podcasting is still pretty new to me and you're a bit of a queen in this area. So no, I'm at your service.
No, I appreciate it. But I thought what would be quite good would be all the episodes I listened to, every single one, there was a jaw-dropping moment when you were left with, what the fuck is going on? What is happening?
Yeah.
And I thought, I know you said that you don't like to give your opinions, and I try not to give mine either, but sometimes I wanted your opinion. I wanted to know what you were thinking and all these jaw-dropping moments and all these things you kept telling. And I wanted to discuss it with somebody, what the hell is going on with this case? So I thought it would be good to maybe go through each episode. And for people that haven't listened to your podcast yet, they could maybe, before we start talking about it, they could go and listen and then come back. And then there's the discussion. So if people are thinking the same as I was, that they wanted more, they wanted an opinion or thoughts. Perfect. It's a nice combination, a nice compliment.
Absolutely.
So that was my thought.
Lovely.
So shall we start with episode number 1?
Let's do it.
So in this episode, you just kind of setting the scene. You were telling all the facts. You made it clear that you weren't going to give your opinions. You were going to try not, just the facts. You told a wee bit about Jodie and Luke and what they were like and what they both enjoyed doing and just the events leading up to Jodie's body being found. And then you start to, just at the end of the episode, you start to tell of Luke's sort of isolation by police officers and him being clearly singled out immediately by them straight away.
Yeah.
So that was kind of what that episode was about. So shall we dive in? I've got my questions in my car. I've got so much, Naomi.
Let's do it. You throw them at me, Dawn. I'm ready.
So the first question you asked your listeners was, do you trust the justice system? So I'm curious, do you trust the justice system?
Somebody said something that I feel like I almost didn't realise this is how I felt until she said it. One of the people that I vox popped said, we have to, because if we don't, what do we have? And that's a good point. But when I asked that question at the beginning of the podcast, I think I would have said, yes, I do trust the justice system. It's never let me down. But then you do open that up a little bit. And then you think about the other people that perhaps have been wronged by the justice system. And I don't even mean just miscarriages of justice, but actually people who have committed horrendous crimes and they've had a very lenient light sentence, or they've got let off on a technicality. I don't actually. If I look at it now, no, I don't. And for many different reasons, but not just a straightforward miscarriage of justice. I think sometimes the other way, it's really hard too.
Yeah. I think before I started podcasting and looking into the stories and covering so many miscarriages of justice, they're just there. You just assume they're going to be there for you if you need them. The police, and they'll be on your side and they'll do the right thing. But I spoke to the Miscarriage of Justice organisation, and even though they deal with miscarriages of justice, she still said that yes, she does believe in it. It's flawed, but you've got to believe in it.
Right.
But I'm struggling a wee bit because there must be good ones out there. I know that there are good police officers out there, but oh God, they really make a mess of it sometimes, don't they?
Do you know what? I sometimes think like we're all human, and the police officers are human, and I totally understand it's a stressful job, but I think there are, as we've seen recently in the press dawn, Wayne Couzens, who killed Sarah Everard, and David Carrick, who's just been done for all those rapes in London. They're both serving police officers, and they have committed awful crimes. And I think there's always going to be bad people in every single industry. Nurses, we completely trust them with our lives, but look at what's happened with Lucy Letby, So I think, can we ever have a perfect justice system? No, because it's made of humans, and humans are emotional beings. And I think the answer is probably no.
And you get that in every job, don't you? So I guess I've had experience. Every job I've gone for, there's always one person that's just a bit of a shit. It's not quite right. And I suppose, why would you not have that in, every profession? It's like you say, we're just human.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, well, we'll get further into that. But the other thing you mentioned was the fact that Luke's teacher expressed a concern because he'd written an essay expressing violence.
Yes.
I mean, wow, wasn't that really helpful, was it? I mean, no, I didn't think much of that.
No, I mean, do you know what? Around that age, and like I said, I do teach at a college. I have 16 to 19-year-olds predominantly, but I do have adults as well. They get to do creative projects, and some of the things that they've written or they've gone out and filmed, because I do broadcast journalism and I do factual television. So a lot of that involves documentary making, or it involves news items. And I'll give them creative freedom, and I'll say, I'm looking for you to do a sort of in-depth documentary on something. It's completely up to you. The choice is yours what you do, but here's the criteria. And some of the subjects they come back with are really dark. And I know that the creative writing students, they're in the classroom next to us, and they write stories that, honestly, I mean, God, my podcast seems like a fairy tale compared to some of the stuff they write. I mean, it does give you alarm bells. It does make you think, oh my God, are you okay? But often I think they're just pushing boundaries at that time. So I don't know if it was related or not, but personally, I don't think that is a massive indicator of someone being a killer.
Yeah. I spoke to a former FBI agent the other week, and she said that...
I love how you casually just dropped that in.
No.
I spoke to an FBI.
She was lovely. But she worked on the shootings in America, and somebody that a young boy shot at the school and shot people, and he had done a few pictures the same day, drew a few pictures, and they were very violent as well. So I guess it is difficult to know. Maybe you're always second guessing, but how would you know? I guess you can't answer that, but how would you know what you need to be more concerned about than others just like yours expressing themselves? I guess it must be difficult. And looking back, I mean, his school teacher clearly thought, oh yes, that must have been that. But I don't think you can just blanket it all. These expressions mean. I don't think that's right.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So when Luke called Jodie's home because her mobile was broken, and there was no answer the first time, but then he called back again, and Jodie's stepdad, her partner, Alan, he answered, and he said that, oh, Jodie's just left. So I'm curious, where was Jodie and where was Alan when Luke phoned the first time? And we weren't even sure if Jodie had just left. So if Jodie was there, why didn't she answer the phone? If maybe Alan was in the toilet and couldn't. If Jodie was there and she just left, I'm just curious, what was that about?
We just don't know. All we know is that there was an attempt to call the house. Nobody answered. And it could have been that Jodie had already left previously. I don't know what Alan was doing. I know that he had been at work that day, so I'm not sure if he'd just come in, but I have no idea as to why they didn't answer the phone the first time, and that's ever been addressed.
Okay. Yeah, that bothers me. And of course my mind goes in these, what if this and what if that? And maybe Jodie was there, maybe they were having a fight with it. I'm just going off on
Oh
all
my
these.
God, the case is full of what ifs.
Yeah, what
This
if?
one, it's a bit crazy.
Yeah. So that was something that I didn't add up for me there a little bit. So Luke said for his mum to tell Jodie if she turned up at his house to meet him at New Battle Abbey.
Yeah.
So he must have met his friends there. So he left his house, sat on the wall, and then went and met his friends. So did they not provide an alibi for him? Surely, because
They did, but it was past the time of her murder. So the prosecution gave the time of death. I think they said it was around 5:15. I'd have to go back to my timeline.
No, you did. You did. It was
5:15. So I think he didn't meet his friends until gone 6 o'clock. So in their eyes, he had enough time to commit a murder. But I think for me, what stands out here is that this boy, I keep saying man because I've obviously interviewed him as a man, but I have to really go back 20 years when he was a boy. And he had never had any police record. He'd never had any violent episodes that had ever been reported. And when she was killed, I mean, her murder was absolutely brutal. It was absolutely horrific. So Jodie was found just off a path called the Ronsdyke Path, which is a path that leads between two villages. One's where Jodie lives and one's where Luke lives. So it was the obvious route for them to take. Now, on the side of this, there's a wall, like a stone wall, and on the other side of that wall is a kind of strip of woodland. It's quite, I wouldn't say it's dense, but there's enough trees there so that when you look into it, you can't see everything. It's got leaves, it's got branches hanging down. She was found there, and God, this is absolutely horrific, and it still penetrates me to my core when I think about it. So she was 14 years old. She'd been stripped, she was bound, she'd had one of her breasts cut off. She had been stabbed in the throat. She'd been beaten. She'd been strangled. It was a really horrific murder. But if you take what happened to her and then you put Luke with his friends less than an hour later, that is such a brutal murder. For someone to go from 0 to 100 like this, he was actually an animal lover. I know a lot of people say killers, they start with animals. Yeah. And that's really horrific. Yeah. And, they might torture a bird or a hamster or something, bugs, and then they kind of progress. Luke was completely the opposite. So he had horses with his mum, and he also had a dog, and the dog's a very important part of the story, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But that was for me, that was the big thing. And that when he was arrested, there was no DNA from Jodie on him. And I find that so incredibly hard to believe, especially as his hair was dirty and his fingernails were dirty. So how does a 14-year-old go from not having killed anyone before or, violently assaulted anyone to doing something like that brutality, and then to go and meet his friends and act like nothing's happened and remain dirty yet not have any DNA on him? That for me was the big, okay, wow, there's something doesn't quite sit right for me here.
That did not sit right at all. But we'll get into that. And also the time of death as well. I want to talk about that as well. Not quite sure. But yeah, even that's 45 minutes. They said it was 5:15. She was likely murdered. And 6 o'clock, he's with his friends having a lovely time with no change in his person. Man, come on. Like you said, that was a brutal murder. How? And nothing was found. That doesn't make sense. I mean, that's straight away. Does that make sense to a detective? Why would that be like, all right?
I wish I had something that would just have allowed me into the investigators' heads, just to get a bit of clarity and a bit of hindsight. And the investigators who led the investigation, they've never done a proper interview where they've sat down and kind of given their thought processes and what they were thinking and sort of given a bit of insight into that. They have shied away from media, which is completely their prerogative, and that's fine. And some of them do still work in the force, so I get it, they're still employed. But at the same time, it's really, really hard to comprehend that in its entirety. There's something off, isn't there? And 14, I mean, I was thinking about 14-year-olds. The girl who lives next door to me, she's 15. And I see how they, at 15, you try and act old and you try and act like you know all about the world and everything's great. But actually, there are little moments where you realise they're babies still, 14-year-olds, but they still, if something scared them, it still runs their parents or their caregivers, and she's a year older than that. So I try and put that back, put her to 14 when I knew her. And yeah, it all feels very weird to me.
Yeah. I was going to ask you if you knew if any of them, the detectives, were still working in the police. So yeah, that's interesting that they've had their work basically dragged through the mud for years.
Yeah.
I would love to have spoken to one of the detectives, like you said, just to get an insight. How do they, there doesn't seem to be any question. This is who was guilty and that's what we're sticking with. And I wonder, do they believe that wholeheartedly? They might narrow-mindedly, blinkered, just, this is it, and they're going to make everything fit with it because they believe wholeheartedly in their guts, if you like, that this person's guilty. Do they know something we don't? Did they get a gut feeling and their gut was wrong that day? Or is it a case of just somebody is better than nobody?
It does make you question that.
Yeah, I'd love to know the answer to that.
So
how can you live with yourself otherwise, that you've done this
well,
to a young lad?
Yeah. Unless, what I have thought all along is, what if he is guilty? Like, what if he is? But I think the podcast wasn't actually necessarily about, is he guilty or not? It's actually about the way the investigation was conducted and that there should be an independent review into how that was conducted because there were failures.
Agree. And yeah, we can't know. You and I can't know. The only people that know are the murderer, if that him or not, and Jodie. But after you put forward all the evidence, there was nothing. It was all circumstantial. I don't believe he should have been convicted. There should have been more. That's what I think your podcast has done. It's just laid bare the facts.
But I'm glad that came across because I think it was ultimately collating a lot of things. There was a lot about this case, and there always is. I mean, murder investigations are never straightforward. There's always a complexity. I think because these were two minors without any previous, and they didn't have this turbulent relationship, They'd only been going out a few months. It wasn't like
I was surprised it was only a few months.
Yeah. I know. And actually, I think a lot of people said that. They kind of had this as a, when you hear about it, you think, oh God, they've probably been together since they were like 11 and it's probably been really turbulent and all their friends have probably got an opinion on it. And actually there was none of that. So yes.
Yeah. No, I was surprised. I don't know why I thought it was like this big love and something had gone wrong. I was 4 months. That's no time at all.
No.
So back to when Jodie's body was found by Luke, and then so you said that Luke called the police, but he said to the police that the body's been found, but he didn't know it was Jodie. He just said a body. Then Stephen Kelly phones the police, and he's in a state, and he's shouting at the phone that it's Jodie, and he starts swearing. So how did Stephen Kelly know it was Jodie, but Luke didn't?
Well, they both went through the wall. So the podcast is called Through the Wall.
Yeah.
So Luke was already out with his dog Mia. So I sort of mentioned that before, that Mia she's a big part of this because she was a trained tracker dog. So
he got Mia, and then he wanted to train her as a tracker dog. Was it a police officer who was training him or something?
It was, I think he was a former something, whether it was the military or the police, I can't remember. But yes, she had been trained by somebody, yeah.
Why did he want to do that? Just out of interest?
He was very outdoorsy. The whole family was, but he had a knife to go fishing and camping and all of that kind of stuff. So it was just one of those things, I think, that he was interested in. Small town Scotland, what can you do? You can utilise the beautiful scenery and countryside that you're in. And that was part of it. So, and that kind of going back to how Luke loved animals here, that they'd actually got Mia properly trained. So she was brilliant. And he gave her a command, and he, sort of said, find Jodie. So they were walking along, and as he was walking towards Jodie's house, so going to Roansdyke Path, he came across Alice, who was Jodie's grandmother, Janine, who was Jodie's sister, and then Stephen Kelly, who was Janine's boyfriend. And they then decided to go back the way that Luke had gone, just in case they thought he'd missed anything. And do you know what? I kind of understand that because he was 14. And I'm just thinking now, I'm just putting because I've got kids. If my daughter was walking on her own and she'd been missing, and her 14-year-old boyfriend, who would have been in year 9 at school, if we think about it in that way, in year 9, walking towards me, I would probably say, do you know what? I'm a responsible adult. We've done this direction. Let's go back. And so they went back and they went up past this V-shaped hole in the wall. So it was kind of, the wall had cracked and it had come away. And on the thumbnail of my podcast, you can see it's Luke standing in front of the V, and they sort of had to kind of actually climb over and through the wall. And it was Luke and Stephen that went together. And Luke, at first sight, he was like, oh my God, is that like a mannequin? He saw a leg. And then Stephen went over. So that's her sister's boyfriend. And then he screamed. And then Alice went over. So that was the grandmother. And she cradled Jodie, which I totally get. Like, that's your granddaughter, and you see her in that state. Of course, you are going to cradle her. Luke started off on the phone. He was giving them directions. And then that when they arrived, they were there under 3 pieces of false information.
Yeah,
so
where did they get that from? That was something.
So when they hadn't realised that they had met up, I just think he hadn't mentioned that nobody else was with him. So he was there. They thought he was on a bike because he usually travelled with a bike. And when Jodie's parents had reported him missing, I think they had assumed that he might have had a bike and that he had been the only one to find the body. But of course, he wasn't. There was 4 of them and the tracker dog. So that was really, really, it's quite big information, because the reason that they said they took Luke is because he found the body. It's worth saying here as well that Luke, should I describe what Luke looks like? Because I think it's quite an important part of the story. So Luke, I guess by nowadays descriptions, would have been like a skater boy-esque. So he had he had like long hair, wore bandanas, wore like, black T-shirts with like rock stars on them, and he had Parker jackets, and to be honest, nowadays I wouldn't even look up, and actually I don't think I would have done then, but this was a small village in Scotland, small town Scotland, so I can understand why people might have thought, oh, he looks a bit different. Exactly. And what they did actually first was they kept Luke with them and they asked him to show them where the body was. Now, I'm not a police detective, but if a child has come to me and said, there's a body over there and it's really bad, I wouldn't re-traumatize that child by bringing them back. At that moment, they didn't know anything, So that for me was a really big red flag, that they asked him to go back and show them, because it's not, like I said, it's not a really dense forest. This is a strip of woodland. So you can really clearly see the body. You're a blooming policeman, you can go and have a look.
You should have been able to stand at the other side of the wall and just say it's through there, and
through the wall, exactly. Exactly that. So that was another thing that I didn't think was, very good. And then they took all of them, the whole search party. They all went to a local high school where they had sort of cornered off the car park and used that as a meeting point. And there was a point where Luke and Stephen Kelly, Janine's boyfriend, was sat down on a curb smoking. Family were starting to hear what had happened. They were all turning up at this point. There was a lot of grieving. There was a lot of crying. And then Luke was asked to get into a police car. But the rest of them who had found the body, and remember Alice had cradled Jodie's body, they were left there to kind of mingle with the family and grieve and support each other. But Luke was put in the back of a police car and he was taken to the station. And this is within like a very short period of time, a very, very short period of time. I need to go back and look at the exact times, but I think within the hour of finding her body and him being taken away. And they said that it was really to get his clothes and put them into forensic evidence. But again, why wouldn't they do that with all 4? Mm-hmm. That was what really, really confused me.
Mm-hmm. But then Stephen Kelly phoned to say that he found a body as well. So why were they under the assumption that it was only Luke? And they're saying, oh, that's why we took him away to get his clothes. Was it a lack of communication, do you think?
I think it was because when Jodie's mother reported Jodie missing, she had been under the assumption that she'd been with Luke all night. So she'd sent a text message to Luke's phone because Jodie's was broken saying, I think it was like, right, Toad, say goodbye to Luke. Yeah. You're going to be grounded, of that kind of nature. And that's when he rang and said, she's not with me. But I think, they'd obviously gone to the police and said, she was meeting her boyfriend. His name's Luke Mitchell. And then he finds her. I think that is the correlation. And they've just gone with that narrative.
Okay. But they just kept going with that narrative, didn't they? There was no
They did. And I think it probably did, the fact that Stephen Kelly that night, had been with Janine and Alice, they'd all travelled out together to try and find her. So Luke was always the one that hadn't been in that search party in the beginning, and he had seen them along the path. So yeah, he was definitely treated different from the rest of them.
And by them doing that in front of the family as well, that's putting a target. I mean, what must they have been thinking? They were with them when they found the body. They're not getting taken away. So straight away, your mind would start working. So they were putting a target on his back by the family as well, straight away.
And the absolute shock and grief that they must have felt. I had a bereavement last week. I was telling you about it. And it's only when you have a bereavement that shock and that grief really hits you again. It really it makes you think about life. It makes you think of so much life. I can't imagine that being your child or your sister or your granddaughter, and also just having, absolutely no answers. But hold on, she's just been out with her boyfriend apparently all night. Well, how are we here? How are we now in a car park speaking to police officers, giving statements because our child has been murdered? I think everyone's brains must have just been completely frazzled, but including Luke's as well, because that was his girlfriend.
And again, if you think, if he didn't do it, this poor lad, he would be devastated, and he's not allowed to get in touch with his mum straight away. And he's just taken away. I mean, God, at 14 years old, you'd be shitting yourself, and it'd be awful. Yeah. What's going on?
Yeah.
So that wasn't handled very well at all. I mean, okay, you wanted to get his clothes, but there's ways to do it, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think, they should, that should have been priority, to get all of the search party and anyone that went up to Jodie, especially, to take their clothes for forensic evidence. It was very clear from the way that she was left that this was a horrific murder. She didn't bind herself. So that is how that should have been treated from the get-go, and it wasn't.
And especially her gran, Alice, because she was cradling her, so she could have potentially have evidence on her as well if there was anything to find. Yeah. So that was a bit of a mistake.
Yeah.
Naomi.
Oh, it does. I mean, you sort of, it can take you into really, really dark place. And, every moment that I was doing this podcast, I just, I never sort of wanted to lose sight of Jodie's face, because this happened to her, and it's just utterly horrific. She did not deserve what happened to her. And if it was Luke, which, again, I can never say I think he's innocent, I think he's guilty, because I just don't know. And I don't think I'd say that about anyone. But if it wasn't, whoever's out is still out there. And that's terrifying.
Yeah. And that's what I mean about the police. I mean, surely they're in that job because they want to maybe see justice done. So perhaps they've not got justice. Is that not important to you? I mean, I know it's all about money and all that now, but God, that should be really front and foremost, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then,
absolutely.
And of course, Luke was, when he got to the station, by himself, before his mum got there, stripped and everything taken off him and put into a paper forensic suit.
Yeah. I mean, He had actually seen his mum. So as they were driving in the police car, they'd seen Corinne. She had been walking towards the station, and the car had pulled up. And she'd been trying to call Luke on the phone, and the police officer actually turned the phone off. And then he was like, well, I want to speak to my mum. So then the police officer turned the phone back on and rang her and said, we're taking your boy to the police station. Jodie's dead. And she's then running towards the police station. Remember, this is small town Scotland. This is a tiny area. And they've passed her on the way.
They stop, don't they, and speak to her?
They stop. And then they tell her that they can't get her in because of potential contamination issues. So she's left to run. And she did run up to the police station, and they weren't reunited for a few hours. So that's that's pretty shocking.
Do you know? Is that? I mean, he's only 14. He's a child. Is when they're trying to get the clothes off you, and are you supposed to be by yourself? Are you not allowed to have a representative with you, a family member or an appropriate adult? Is that procedure?
I mean, you're just supposed to have somebody else in a room.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he was left on his own.
Yeah, which I believe, if I go back, I'm sure there was two officers. But again, I mean, there was no legal representation at this point, which, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, did he need it at the time? No, he wasn't arrested. He was being questioned, and Luke was cooperating. I mean, if that had been my child, I would be absolutely fuming, because at that point, you know, they really could not have known.
Yeah.
You know, this was an hour or so after. They could not have known anything, you know. So that was what really sort of got him stuck in my mind.
Yeah, and they knew she was coming, you know, just wait for her. And they knew she was obviously there, but that's a horrible way to treat, even bad enough Luke, but the mum as well. That was episode 1. So there was a few interesting things in there. Anything else you want to say about episode 1?
No, I just think that was really, like, what I tried to do with that is just set the scene, and actually just to kind of open up the story a little bit more from what they may have seen, and just to personalise Jodie as well, and to offer some sort of personalisation to Luke as well, just so people could know a little bit more about who they were, because I think that is really important here. And you know, every time you see a media headline or whatever, you do get lost in the fact that they were children. And I can't say this enough, and I'm sorry if this bores everyone, but they were kids. They were kids. And this is what's really, really, it just baffles me, the whole thing. But episode 2 is quite the ride.
You kind of eased us in gently-ish in episode 1, and then it takes off.
Yeah. I remember seeing a review after they'd listened to one episode, and they were like, yeah, you know, I like it. I like her style and I like what she's doing. But actually, it's taken a long time to get into the story. I thought, just you wait. And then they came back and they were like, actually, scrap. It's sort of gone 100 miles an hour. And it does. This case it does from now on. There's no rest breaks. It's pretty full on, isn't it?
It is. Just every episode is like, what? It's just, you're really good at that. Leaving on a cliffhanger.
Well, yeah, I mean, do you know what? You know, sometimes as TV producers, podcast producers, you know, you want people to come back and follow through the story. So you do have to make, hopefully, an ethical and moral kind of cliffhanger. I didn't need to. It was about choosing what piece of information I was going to end on, because there was just so many.
Yeah.